The Sherman tank rolled to a stop just inside the tree line, its engine ticking as it cooled in the darkness of the French countryside. Inside, Corporal Ben Harris pressed his ear against the metal hull and listened. The faint rattle of loose tools, the metallic ping of cooling steel, the soft clank of ammunition boxes shifting with every movement. It all echoed through the night like a dinner bell for German patrols. He had watched 3 tanks get ambushed in the past 2 weeks, each one betrayed by sounds their crews never even knew they were making. But Harris had an idea, one that would change everything. He just needed some rubber, a handful of hours, and the willingness to risk a court-martial for unauthorized modifications to United States Army property. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The rain had stopped an hour before dawn on the 15th of June, 1944, leaving the Norman hedgerows glistening and the narrow roads turned to rivers of mud. Corporal Ben Harris sat on an overturned fuel drum outside the motor pool tent, a cup of bitter coffee going cold in his hands as he watched the mechanics work on a damaged Sherman that had limped back from the front lines the night before. The tank bore the scars of close combat, pockmarked armor, and a shattered track that had taken 4 men and a winch to repair. But it was the crew's story that kept replaying in Harris's mind, the same story he had heard too many times in the past month. They had been moving into position under cover of darkness, trying to flank a German strongpoint that had been giving the infantry hell for 3 days straight. The plan was solid, the route was clear, and they had maintained radio silence perfectly. But somewhere in the darkness, a German patrol had heard them coming. Not the engine, the Sherman's Ford GAA was actually quieter than most people expected at idle. It was everything else, the constant metallic symphony that accompanied every tank movement. The clatter of track links, the rattle of loose equipment, the ping and clang of metal on metal as the crew shifted inside the hull. The Germans had set up a Panzerschreck team in the perfect spot and waited. The first rocket had punched through the side armor before the crew even knew they were compromised. 3 men died in that tank. The loader and the gunner burned before anyone could pull them out. The driver lost both legs and would probably never walk again. The commander and the assistant driver survived only because they had been fast enough to bail out before the ammunition cooked off. Harris had helped pull them from the wreck, and he could still smell the burning metal and flesh when he closed his eyes. He was not a combat soldier by trade, not really. Harris had grown up in a small town in Michigan, where his father ran a garage that serviced farm equipment and the occasional automobile. By the time he was 12, Ben could diagnose engine problems by sound alone. At 15, he was rebuilding transmissions. At 17, he had modified the governor on a tractor to increase its pulling power by 20%. A modification that had earned him both praise and a stern warning about warranty violations. When the war broke out and the draft notice came, the Army had taken one look at his background and sent him straight to tank maintenance school. Now, 2 years later, he was somewhere in France keeping Shermans running in conditions that would have made his father weep. Mud that could stop a tank dead in its tracks, mechanical failures that happened hourly, and replacement parts that sometimes arrived and sometimes did not. But the noise problem, that was something different. That was not about keeping engines running or tracks turning. That was about keeping men alive. Harris stood and walked over to the damaged Sherman, running his hand along the engine deck, where dozens of small dents and scratches told the story of months of hard use. He pressed his palm flat against the metal and felt the residual warmth from the engine. Then he rapped his knuckles against it, listening to the hollow ring that echoed across the motor pool. Every piece of metal on a tank was essentially a drum, and every movement made music that carried far too well in the quiet hours before dawn. Sergeant William Crawford emerged from the motor pool tent, wiping his hands on a rag that was already black with grease. He was a career Army man, 15 years in service, and he ran the motor pool with an efficiency that bordered on obsessive. Crawford had survived North Africa and Sicily, and he had strong opinions about how things should be done. Most of those opinions involved following regulations to the letter. Harris, "Quit daydreaming and get that transmission inspection finished," Crawford called out, his voice carrying the particular edge that sergeants developed after years of dealing with corporals who thought too much. "We have 6 tanks that need to be ready by 1400 hours, and you are standing around like you are waiting for the war to end." Harris turned away from the damaged Sherman and nodded, but his mind was still working on the problem. Rubber. That was the answer. Rubber dampened vibrations, absorbed sound, turned harsh metallic clangs into soft thumps that did not carry nearly as far. He had seen it used in civilian applications back home. Rubber gaskets to quiet noisy engines, rubber mounts to isolate vibration, rubber strips on the inside of toolboxes to keep wrenches from rattling. If he could line the inside of a Sherman's engine deck with rubber, create a barrier between the metal components and the hull itself, it might cut down on the noise signature dramatically. The problem was finding rubber in a combat zone where everything was rationed and controlled. You could not just requisition rubber strips for an unauthorized modification project. You had to be creative, and creative usually meant bending rules that the Army had written in triplicate. Harris spent the rest of the morning finishing the transmission inspection, his hands moving through the familiar motions while his brain worked on the noise problem. By lunch, he had a plan forming. By early afternoon, he had started quietly collecting materials. The first rubber came from a destroyed Jeep that had been hauled into the salvage yard after hitting a mine. The floor mats were torn but still usable, thick rubber with a backing that could be cut into strips. Harris claimed he needed them for cushioning some replacement parts that were being shipped, which was not technically a lie, even if it was not technically the truth either. The salvage corporal barely looked up from his clipboard as he signed off on the requisition. The second source was more delicate. There was a supply sergeant named Victor Rodriguez who ran a semi-legal trading operation out of a tent near the quartermaster depot. Rodriguez could get almost anything if you had something worth trading, and Harris had been saving a bottle of genuine Kentucky bourbon that his sister had somehow managed to mail to him 3 months ago. He had been saving it for something special, and this qualified. Rodriguez examined the bottle with the careful attention of a jeweler appraising diamonds, holding it up to the light and checking the seal before nodding slowly. "You want rubber, the flexible kind that can handle heat and oil. I can do that. Give me 2 days." Harris spent those 2 days preparing his test subject. There was an older Sherman in the motor pool, serial number 30317, that had been designated for rebuilding after taking minor damage to its suspension. It was operational, but not scheduled for combat duty for at least a week, which gave Harris a window to experiment. He worked on it during his off hours. After the regular maintenance shifts ended, and most of the other mechanics had headed to their tents or the makeshift recreation area. The engine deck of a Sherman tank was a complex piece of engineering, a series of removable panels that allowed access to the Ford GAA V8 engine and its associated systems. Harris started by removing the panels one at a time, cleaning them thoroughly, and then laying them out in the maintenance bay. He measured each panel carefully, noting where the metal was thinnest and where vibrations would be strongest. When Rodriguez delivered the rubber, it came in the form of industrial belting, thick and flexible with one smooth side and one textured side. It smelled of oil and chemicals, and Harris suspected it had come from some French factory that the Germans had abandoned during their retreat. He did not ask questions because questions had a way of complicating simple transactions. He cut the rubber into strips using a sharp utility knife, working by the light of a paraffin lamp because electric lighting was reserved for essential repairs. Each strip was sized to fit the interior surface of the engine deck panels, creating a layer of insulation between the metal and the mechanical components beneath. He used a combination of adhesive and small bolts to secure the rubber in place, working carefully to ensure that nothing would interfere with the engine's operation or ventilation. The work took 3 nights. His hands developed blisters that burst and reformed as calluses. His back ached from bending over the panels for hours at a time, but slowly, methodically, he lined every accessible surface inside the engine deck with rubber dampening material. When he was finished, he reassembled the panels and stepped back to examine his work. From the outside, the tank looked exactly the same, but inside, where metal had once touched metal and every vibration had found 100 surfaces to echo against, there was now a barrier that would swallow sound instead of broadcasting it. The test came on a warm night in late June, when the moon was nothing but a thin crescent, and the countryside was dark enough that a man could barely see his hand in front of his face. Harris had convinced his friend, Private First Class Joseph Keegan, to help him conduct an unofficial field evaluation. Keegan was a radio operator who had seen enough combat to understand why noise discipline mattered, and he was willing to risk some trouble if it meant improving their chances of surviving the next push. They drove the modified Sherman out to a field about 2 miles from camp, moving slowly along roads that were barely more than dirt tracks. Harris drove while Keegan sat in the commander's position, both of them wearing their headsets but maintaining radio silence. When they reached the designated spot, Harris brought the tank to a stop and shut down the engine. They waited in the darkness for 10 minutes, letting their eyes adjust and their ears attune to the ambient sounds of the French countryside. Crickets sang in the grass, a distant owl called from a stand of trees, and somewhere far away, artillery rumbled like approaching thunder. Harris started the engine again, letting it warm up to operating temperature before putting the tank in gear and moving forward at a crawl. Keegan stood in the commander's hatch with his eyes closed, listening. They made a slow circuit of the field, the tracks clanking and the engine purring, but something was different. The harsh metallic symphony that usually accompanied every Sherman movement had been reduced to a softer, more muffled sound. The engine deck no longer rang like a bell with every vibration. The tools and equipment that normally rattled with every bump now made only quiet thumps against the rubber padding. After 20 minutes of maneuvering, Harris brought the tank to a stop again and climbed out. Keegan was already on the ground, walking back along the route they had taken. When he returned, his face was split by a wide grin. "It works," Keegan said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper, even though they were miles from anyone who might overhear. "I could still hear you coming, but it was maybe half as loud as usual, maybe less. The high-pitched stuff is almost gone completely. If you were moving slow and there was any background noise at all, wind or artillery or whatever, I think you could get within 100 yards of someone before they heard you." Harris felt something tight in his chest begin to loosen. 100 yards. That was the difference between getting ambushed and getting into position. That was the difference between burning to death in a metal coffin and completing your mission. But the real test would not come from a friendly evaluation in a dark field. The real test would come from showing it to Sergeant Crawford, and then to the officers who actually made decisions about how tanks were equipped and operated. Harris knew that the Army did not like unauthorized modifications. He knew that Crawford ran the motor pool by the book and would not appreciate one of his corporals experimenting on military equipment without permission. But he also knew that 3 men had burned to death in a tank 2 weeks ago, because a German patrol had heard them coming from a quarter mile away. The next morning, Harris approached Crawford in the motor pool. The sergeant was reviewing maintenance logs, his reading glasses perched on his nose, as he compared reported problems against completed repairs. Harris waited until Crawford looked up before speaking. "Sergeant, I need to show you something. It is about tank 30317. Crawford set down his clipboard and removed his glasses. "What did you do to my tank, Harris?" "I modified the engine deck, added sound dampening. It reduces the noise signature by approximately 50% based on field testing." Harris kept his voice level and professional, stating facts rather than making excuses. Crawford was quiet for a long moment, his weathered face unreadable. Then he stood and walked toward the tank without saying anything. Harris followed, his heart rate picking up, as he prepared for the reprimand he knew was probably coming. The sergeant examined the modified engine deck carefully, opening panels and studying the rubber strips that Harris had installed. He ran his fingers along the edges, checking the adhesive bonds. He opened and closed panels multiple times, listening to the sound they made. Finally, he straightened up and looked at Harris with an expression that might have been respect, or might have been irritation, or might have been both. "This is a court-martial offense," Crawford said quietly. "Unauthorized modification of military equipment. You could be busted down to private and spend the rest of the war in a disciplinary unit." Harris nodded. "Yes, Sergeant." "On the other hand," Crawford continued, "if this actually works the way you say it does, it might save lives, real American lives, not just theoretical ones in some training manual." He paused, thinking. "We need to show this to Captain Morrison. Let him decide whether you are a genius or an idiot." Captain James Morrison commanded the tank company that the motor pool supported, and he was the kind of officer who had earned his rank through competence rather than connections. He had fought in North Africa and had lost enough men to understand that innovation sometimes mattered more than regulations. When Crawford brought Harris and the modified tank to his attention, Morrison listened to the explanation without interrupting. Then he insisted on a demonstration. They conducted the test at dusk, using a regular Sherman and the modified one for comparison. Morrison positioned himself 500 yards away, while both tanks maneuvered through a wooded area, approaching his position from different angles. The difference was obvious even to someone who was not trained in tank operations. The regular Sherman announced its presence from a quarter-mile away, its engine deck creating a constant metallic rattle that carried clearly through the trees. The modified tank was detectable at maybe 200 yards, and even then, the sound was muffled enough that it could easily be mistaken for distant traffic or some other ambient noise. Morrison returned to the motor pool with a thoughtful expression on his face. He pulled Harris aside, while Crawford and several other mechanics waited nearby. "Corporal, how long would it take to modify an entire platoon? 5 tanks." Harris did some quick mental math. "If I had help and access to materials, maybe a week. Maybe less if we worked around the clock." Morrison nodded slowly. "Do it. Crawford will authorize whatever materials you need from salvage or supply. If Rodriguez has to get involved, I do not want to know about it. But I also do not want any delays. We have a major operation planned for mid-July, and I want at least 1 platoon equipped with your quiet modification before we roll out." The authorization changed everything. What had been an unauthorized experiment became an official project, and suddenly Harris had resources. Crawford assigned 3 other mechanics to help with the work, all of them experienced men who understood engines and could follow Harris's instructions. Rodriguez appeared with 2 large rolls of rubber belting, claiming he had found them in an abandoned factory. And nobody questioned the story too closely, because questioning often led to answers that created problems. They worked 12-hour shifts, breaking only for meals and a few hours of sleep. The first tank took 8 hours to modify. The second took 6. By the time they finished the 5th tank, they had the process down to under 4 hours per vehicle. Harris developed a template system that allowed them to pre-cut the rubber strips for each panel type, significantly reducing the customization required for each individual tank. The adhesive was applied in a specific pattern that maximized bonding while minimizing weight and heat retention. Every modification was documented in case other units wanted to replicate the process. Word spread through the division faster than official communications ever moved. Tankers who heard about the quiet modification started showing up at the motor pool to see the results for themselves. Some were skeptical, convinced that nothing could make a Sherman truly quiet. Others were immediately interested, especially those who had survived ambushes and knew firsthand how sound betrayed positions in the darkness. Lieutenant Colonel Andrew Barker, the battalion commander, arrived at the motor pool on the 3rd day of the modification project. He was a tall man with graying hair and the kind of command presence that made junior officers nervous and enlisted men attentive. Harris was in the middle of installing rubber strips on the 4th tank when Barker appeared, and he barely had time to straighten up and salute before the colonel started asking questions. Barker listened to the explanation with the focused attention of someone who understood that small improvements could have large consequences. He climbed into the modified tank, examined the rubber installations, and asked detailed questions about heat resistance, maintenance requirements, and potential failure modes. Harris answered each question as accurately as he could, acknowledging the limitations of his testing, while emphasizing the clear noise reduction benefits. After 30 minutes of inspection and discussion, Barker climbed out of the tank and looked at Morrison. "I want a full company modified by the end of the month, 15 tanks. Can your motor pool handle that?" Morrison glanced at Crawford, who glanced at Harris. Harris did some quick calculations and nodded. "Yes, sir. If we maintain current staffing and material supply, we can modify 15 tanks in 2 weeks, maybe less." Barker nodded sharply. "Make it happen. I am also sending a report up to division headquarters recommending that this modification be evaluated for Army-wide implementation. Corporal Harris, you might have just improved the survival rate for every Sherman crew in the European theater." The words should have felt like a triumph, but Harris was too tired and too focused on the work to fully process them. He simply nodded, saluted, and returned to installing rubber strips while his hands shook slightly from exhaustion and something that might have been pride or might have been fear of failure. The modifications continued through late June and into July. The motor pool operated almost continuously, with mechanics working in shifts to keep the production line moving. Harris trained additional personnel on the installation process, creating a small cadre of specialists who could replicate his work without direct supervision. The rubber supply became a constant concern, and Rodriguez worked overtime to maintain the flow of materials from sources that probably ranged from legitimate salvage to creative acquisition. On the 12th of July, 1944, the modified platoon rolled out as part of a major offensive operation designed to break through German defensive positions south of Caen. Harris watched them go from the motor pool, 5 Shermans with muffled engine decks heading into combat, to test whether rubber and adhesive could really make a difference when bullets and rockets were flying. The platoon returned 36 hours later, all 5 tanks still operational. They had successfully conducted a night flanking maneuver that put them in position to support an infantry assault at dawn. The Germans had known something was happening, but had been unable to pinpoint the armor movement in the darkness. The element of surprise had been maintained just long enough to make a difference. 2 German anti-tank guns had been destroyed before they could be repositioned, and the infantry advance had proceeded with significantly lighter casualties than expected. The platoon commander, Lieutenant David Brennan, found Harris in the motor pool the day after they returned. He was a young officer, maybe 24 years old, with dark circles under his eyes and the hollow look of someone who had not slept in days. He approached Harris while the corporal was checking oil levels on a freshly repaired engine and waited until Harris noticed him before speaking. "Your modification saved lives, Corporal. Maybe a dozen men who would have walked into machine gun fire if we had been detected earlier. I do not know if anyone will give you a medal for this, but you should know that it mattered." Harris wiped his hands on a rag and nodded, unsure of what to say. Brennan lingered for a moment as if he wanted to say something else, then simply saluted and walked away. Harris watched him go, feeling the weight of responsibility settle onto his shoulders. The modification worked, which meant more tanks would need to be modified. More crews would depend on it. More lives would hang on, whether rubber strips and adhesive could really turn a Sherman into a ghost in the darkness. By the end of July, 78 Sherman tanks in the division had been modified with Harris's quiet drive system. The nickname had started somewhere in the ranks and spread rapidly, tankers referring to the modification as the quiet drive to distinguish modified vehicles from standard ones. Requests came in from other divisions, other units, other mechanics who wanted to know how to replicate the process. Harris found himself writing detailed instructions, creating diagrams, and even teaching short classes to mechanics from other battalions who were sent to learn the technique. Division headquarters sent an engineering team to evaluate the modification in early August. They conducted extensive tests, measuring noise levels with specialized equipment that Harris had never seen before. They interviewed crews who had used the quiet drive in combat. They examined modified tanks that had been in service for weeks, checking for heat damage, adhesive failure, or any other problems that might have developed over time. Their report went up the chain of command to theater headquarters and from there to the Pentagon itself. Harris did not know about any of that until Lieutenant Colonel Barker called him to battalion headquarters in mid-August. The meeting took place in a tent that served as the battalion command post, and Harris stood at attention while Barker explained that the quiet drive modification had been approved for implementation across all armored units in the European theater. Production was being scaled up. Proper rubber materials were being sourced through official supply channels, and mechanics were being trained at depot level to perform the modification on new tanks before they even reached combat units. "You did good work, Corporal," Barker said, and there was genuine warmth in his voice. "The Army is recommending you for a Bronze Star for this. I know it is not a combat decoration, but it recognizes that what you did mattered." Harris stood in the command tent and tried to process the information. A Bronze Star, Army-wide implementation. His modification, the one he had started working on by lamplight while exhausted and covered in grease, was going to become standard equipment. Somewhere in the United States, engineers were probably already figuring out how to mass-produce the components. Somewhere in England, depot mechanics were being trained on the installation process. And somewhere in France, Germany, and eventually beyond, tank crews would move through the darkness a little more quietly, with a little more chance of surviving the night. "Thank you, sir," Harris said, because he could not think of anything else to say. The war continued through the fall and into the winter. The modified Shermans pushed east across France, through Belgium, and into Germany itself. The quiet drive modification became standard enough that tankers stopped commenting on it. just another piece of equipment like the radios or the periscopes. Harris continued working in the motor pool, fixing engines and training new mechanics, and occasionally installing the quiet drive on tanks that had been repaired or rebuilt. The work was never-ending, the conditions were miserable, and men kept dying despite every improvement and innovation. But sometimes, late at night when the motor pool was quiet and Harris lay in his cot trying to sleep, he thought about Lieutenant Brennan's words, "Your modification saved lives." He thought about the crews who had made it through night operations because German patrols had not heard them coming. He thought about the loaders and gunners and drivers who had gone home to their families instead of burning in metal coffins on French roads. He had not invented a revolutionary new weapon. He had not won a decisive battle. He had just taken some rubber and adhesive and solved a problem that nobody else had thought to address. But in a war where margins were measured in yards and seconds, and the smallest advantage could mean the difference between living and dying, his quiet modification had mattered. In December 1944, Harris received a letter from his sister back in Michigan. She wrote about snow and Christmas preparations and how their father's garage was doing more business than ever because nobody could afford new farm equipment and everything had to be repaired instead. At the end of the letter, she mentioned that a reporter from the Detroit newspaper had come by asking questions about Ben's war service, something about a modification he had made to tanks that was saving lives. Their father had refused to talk to the reporter, not because he was not proud, but because he figured Ben would tell them about it himself when he got home. Harris folded the letter carefully and put it in his pocket, next to his heart. When he got home, if he got home, he would have a lot to tell them. But for now, there was work to do. There were tanks to repair, engines to rebuild, and a war to win. The quiet drive modification had become part of the larger machinery of victory, one small innovation among thousands, but Harris knew that it had made a difference. In the spring of 1945, as the war in Europe drew toward its conclusion, Harris found himself working on a Sherman that bore the scars of months of combat. The armor was pitted and scorched, the engine had been rebuilt twice, and the quiet drive rubber was worn, but still functional. As he worked, he thought about all the tanks he had modified, all the crews who had benefited from those few hours of work by lamplight back in the summer of 1944. The war ended in May. Harris was still in Germany when the surrender came, still working in a motor pool that now spent more time maintaining vehicles for occupation duty than preparing them for combat. The Bronze Star arrived in June, presented at a ceremony that felt simultaneously important and inadequate. How did you measure the value of a modification that had saved an unknown number of lives? What medal could properly recognize the decision to line engine decks with rubber when regulations said you should not modify military equipment without authorization? Harris returned to Michigan in October 1945, carrying his medals and his memories and the knowledge that he had solved a problem that needed solving. His father's garage was still there, still servicing farm equipment and the occasional automobile. Ben Harris went back to work, rebuilding transmissions and diagnosing engine problems by sound. And if he sometimes woke up in the middle of the night, thinking about tanks moving through darkness and German patrols that never heard them coming, he never talked about it much. But in motor pools and maintenance depots, across the United States Army, the quiet drive modification remained standard equipment for years after the war ended. Tank mechanics learned the installation process as part of their basic training. Engineering manuals included detailed specifications for the rubber components and adhesive patterns. And somewhere in the Pentagon, filed away in archives that few people would ever see, there were reports documenting how one corporal's unauthorized modification had improved the survival rate of American tank crews during the final year of the war in Europe. The modification had worked because Harris understood that tanks were not just weapons or vehicles, but complex machines that interacted with their environment in predictable ways. He had recognized that sound was a liability in darkness, that metal amplified vibrations, and that rubber could interrupt the acoustic signature that betrayed positions to enemy patrols. He had solved the problem with available materials and practical engineering without waiting for official authorization or formal research programs. Years later, when military historians studied the innovations of World War II, the quiet drive modification would be mentioned in footnotes and technical appendices, one small improvement among the countless adaptations that had characterized American military operations. But for the crews who had used it, For the men who had survived night operations because their tanks moved more quietly through the darkness, it had been more than a footnote. It had been the difference between coming home and burning in a field somewhere in France. Ben Harris lived until 1996, and by the time he died, the Shermans he had worked on were museum pieces and historical artifacts. But the principle he had recognized, that reducing noise signatures improved tactical survivability, remained relevant. Modern armored vehicles incorporated sophisticated sound dampening systems as standard equipment. Engineers designed components to minimize acoustic signatures. Acoustic stealth became a recognized element of military vehicle design, all built on the same basic insight that Harris had acted on during the summer in France. He had been a corporal in a motor pool, a mechanic who got his hands dirty and solved problems with whatever materials he could find. He had not set out to revolutionize tank design, or earn medals, or become part of military history. He had just wanted to stop men from dying because German patrols heard them coming through the darkness. And for a little while, in a war that consumed millions of lives, his rubber strips and adhesive had made a difference that mattered.